A surveillance camera captures an African-American man, dressed in worn-out clothing, sitting on a cold city sidewalk. His shoulders are broad but slightly hunched, as if weighed down by something heavier than just fatigue. His gaze is calm, yet behind his eyes lies a history few would ever suspect. The city around him moves at its usual pace. Pedestrians shuffle past, some sparing him a glance, others pretending not to see. A siren wails in the distance, growing louder, slicing through the early evening air. Marcus Carter wasn't always here. Once he was a decorated Navy SEAL, a man who had seen the world from battlefields to secret operations most civilians would never know existed. But life had taken a cruel turn, leaving him stripped of his purpose, without a home, and invisible to the very nation he once served. Now his focus was simple: survive another day while keeping to himself, unnoticed. He had no interest in drawing attention. Yet, attention was about to find him. 2 police officers patrol the area, scanning the streets for signs of trouble. One of them, Officer Richard Evans, a man with a notorious reputation, spots Marcus. Something about him, perhaps his presence, his silence, or simply the way he looks, rubs Evans the wrong way. He nudges his partner, Officer Daniel Torres, and mutters, "That guy doesn't belong here." Evans's steps quicken as he approaches. Marcus remains seated, unmoving. The encounter that follows will be more than just another routine confrontation. It will ignite a series of events that will challenge perceptions, unravel hidden truths, and force everyone involved to face the reality of their own judgments. What's about to unfold will remind us why we should never judge someone by their appearance. Stay until the end to witness the shocking truth. The city pulsed with life, but for Marcus Carter it was nothing more than background noise, a rhythm that no longer matched his own. The streets of downtown were crowded with hurried commuters, honking taxis, and flashing billboards advertising a world that seemed distant from his own reality. The cold pavement beneath him was just another reminder of how far he had fallen. The alley where he often rested was nestled between an old bookstore and a convenience store, a place where most people never bothered to look. A battered duffel bag sat beside him, containing the few belongings he had managed to hold on to. He pulled his coat tighter around his frame, shielding himself from the biting evening air. From his vantage point, he watched the world move. A mother tugged her child's hand, hurrying past him without a second glance. A businessman in a tailored suit scrolled through his phone, too absorbed in his screen to acknowledge anything around him. No one saw him. No one ever did, except for them. 2 police officers walked the sidewalk, their presence unmistakable in their dark uniforms. Officer Richard Evans led the way, his stride full of confidence, his eyes scanning for anything or anyone that didn't belong. Behind him, Officer Daniel Torres followed, his posture less rigid, his gaze more curious than accusatory. Evans' eyes locked onto Marcus. "There he is," Evans muttered, nudging Torres. "Look at him, just sitting there like he owns the place." Torres glanced at Marcus, his brow furrowing slightly. "He's not bothering anyone," Evans scoffed. "That's what they do. Sit around, waiting for an opportunity. Next thing you know, they're causing trouble." Marcus remained still, aware of their approach. He had encountered officers before, some indifferent, some aggressive. He knew the look Evans was giving him, the kind that said he had already been judged. Evans stopped in front of him, looming over him with a practiced authority. "Hey, what are you doing here?" Marcus looked up slowly, his deep, steady gaze meeting Evans without hostility. "Just sitting," he answered, his voice calm but firm. Evans folded his arms. "Yeah, and how long you plan on sitting here?" Marcus exhaled through his nose, already sensing where this was going. "I don't know, didn't think there was a time limit." Evans smirked, glancing at Torres as if to say, "See what I mean?" Then he turned back to Marcus. "You got ID?" Marcus hesitated. He had one, but he also knew that in situations like this, showing it wouldn't change much. Still, he reached into his coat pocket, moving slowly, ensuring there was nothing threatening about his actions. Before he could pull it out, Evans put a hand on his holster. "Nice and easy," he warned. Marcus paused, his fingers brushing against the worn edges of his wallet. He had faced worse than this, far worse. Yet something about this moment, about the way Evans spoke to him, sent a familiar heat through his chest. Not fear, not even anger, just exhaustion. He handed over his ID without a word. Evans snatched it, examining it with a raised brow. "Marcus Carter," he read aloud, dragging out the syllables like they held some hidden meaning. No address, no job, no nothing. Torres shifted uncomfortably. "Come on, Evans, if he's got no warrants, let's move on." But Evans wasn't done. He lowered the ID and stared at Marcus again, this time more intently. "You know, we get complaints about people like you all the time, sleeping in alleys, begging for money, making people uncomfortable." Marcus clenched his jaw, but his voice remained measured. "I don't ask for anything." Evans smirked. "That right? You just sit here all day watching, waiting?" Marcus knew this game. He knew that no matter what he said, it wouldn't satisfy Evans, but he had no intention of giving him the reaction he wanted. "I just exist," Marcus said simply. Evans let out a dry chuckle. "Yeah? Well, maybe not for long." Torres stepped forward slightly. "Evans, we should go." Evans ignored him. "Tell you what, Carter, you need to find somewhere else to exist, because around here," he leaned in, lowering his voice, "you don't belong." Marcus held his stare, unflinching, a battle of wills, unspoken but clear. Then the siren from earlier grew louder. A patrol car turned the corner, its lights flashing as it approached. Evans straightened, still holding Marcus's ID. Torres exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. He could feel the tension thickening, pressing against the night air. Marcus stayed seated, unmoving. Evans wasn't done with him yet. The patrol car's flashing lights cast sharp streaks of red and blue across the sidewalk, illuminating the tense standoff between Marcus and Officer Evans. The siren cut off abruptly, leaving only the hum of the idling engine and the distant noise of the city. Evans turned slightly, glancing at the car before returning his attention to Marcus. His grip on the ID tightened, his expression shifting from smug confidence to something colder. "You got people watching now," Marcus said evenly, nodding toward the car. His voice carried no challenge, just observation. Evans smirked, but there was an edge to it. "Yeah? And what? You think that changes anything?" He raised his voice slightly, making sure the officers in the car could hear. "You're still trespassing, loitering. Hell, for all I know, you're harassing people around here." Marcus exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. "I haven't done anything wrong." "That's what they all say," Evans muttered. He turned to Torres. "Tell me, Torres, we supposed to wait until something happens? Or should we handle this now?" Torres hesitated. His discomfort had been growing ever since they approached Marcus, but now it was undeniable. Evans was pushing something that didn't need to be pushed. "Evans, we don't have cause to arrest him," Torres said, keeping his voice neutral but firm. Evans scoffed. "You're kidding, right?" He gestured broadly at Marcus. "Look at him. He's out here taking up space, making people uncomfortable." Marcus shook his head, his patience thinning. "Making you uncomfortable, you mean?" Evans' jaw tightened, his hand twitched toward his baton. Torres saw the movement and stepped in. "Hey," he said quickly, placing a hand on Evans' arm. "Come on, man, this isn't necessary." Evans yanked his arm away. "Stay out of this, Torres." The officers in the patrol car were watching now, though they hadn't stepped out yet. A few pedestrians had slowed down, sensing the tension in the air. Marcus shifted slightly, his muscles instinctively preparing for the worst. He had been in enough fights to recognize when one was coming. Evans squared his shoulders. "You think you're real smart, huh? Sitting here acting like you don't have to answer to anybody." Marcus looked at him steadily. "I answered your questions. That's not what you wanted, though, is it?" Evans' eyes flashed. "You want to play games? Fine." He stepped back slightly, raising his voice. "Sir, you are causing a public disturbance. I'm asking you one last time. Move along, or we'll have to take you in." Marcus stared at him. "A public disturbance? That's right," Evans said. "People don't feel safe with you hanging around here." Marcus clenched his fists at his sides. He had spent years risking his life to protect others, fighting battles most civilians couldn't begin to imagine. And now here he was, being told he made people feel unsafe just by existing. He took a breath, forcing his body to stay relaxed. "I'm not moving," he said, his voice calm but firm. Evans smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "Wrong answer." Before Torres could react, Evans grabbed Marcus by the arm, yanking him to his feet. The movement was rough, meant to provoke. Marcus stumbled slightly, but caught himself, his body instinctively resisting. "Don't do this," Torres warned, stepping closer. "Too late," Evans muttered. Marcus felt the adrenaline surge through him, the years of training kicking in. He knew he could take Evans down in a second. He could have him on the ground before Torres even had time to react. But he didn't. Instead, he went still, forcing himself to breathe, to ignore the instinct screaming at him to defend himself. "That's right," Evans sneered. "Stay down. You know better than to fight, don't you?" Torres saw Marcus's restraint, the way he held himself back, and for the first time, real doubt crept into his mind. "Evans," he started again, but it was too late. Evans spun Marcus around and shoved him against the wall, pressing his knee into his back. "Marcus Carter, you're under arrest for refusing a lawful order and causing a disturbance," he said, snapping the cuffs onto his wrists. Marcus closed his eyes for a brief moment. He wasn't surprised. The patrol car door opened and one of the officers stepped out. "What's going on?" Evans turned, gripping Marcus's arm. "We've got a situation under control." Torres stepped back, watching as Evans led Marcus toward the car. The pedestrians who had gathered looked on in silence, their expressions ranging from confusion to unease. And somewhere in the crowd, a cell phone camera was recording. Marcus kept his head up as Evans pushed him into the back seat. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The police station was a stark contrast to the city streets. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow over the grey walls and scuffed tile floors. The air smelled of old coffee and paperwork, the atmosphere heavy with the hum of ringing phones and murmured conversations. Marcus Carter sat in a holding cell, his back against the cool concrete wall. The cuffs had been removed, but the tightness in his wrists remained. He flexed his fingers, his mind calm despite the situation. He had been in worse places, far worse. Officer Richard Evans leaned against the booking desk, filling out paperwork with smug satisfaction. "Vagrant, loitering, resisting orders," he muttered as he wrote, shaking his head as if Marcus was nothing more than a stain on the city. Officer Daniel Torres stood nearby, arms crossed, his jaw set. The arrest didn't sit right with him, and the more he thought about it, the worse it felt. Marcus hadn't resisted, he hadn't caused trouble, and yet here he was, sitting in a cell like a criminal. A door swung open, and a commanding voice filled the room. "What the hell is going on here?" Captain Harris strode in, his presence instantly commanding attention. A veteran officer with salt and pepper hair and sharp eyes, he carried an air of authority that silenced the room. He scanned the holding cell, his gaze landing on Marcus. The moment he saw him, something changed in his expression. "That name you just said," Harris asked, turning to the desk sergeant. "Say it again." The sergeant glanced down at the paperwork. "Marcus Carter." Harris's eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, his gaze fixed on Marcus, studying him. Then his expression shifted. Recognition dawned, followed by something that looked almost like disbelief. "Marcus Carter," Harris repeated, more to himself than anyone else. Evans rolled his eyes. "Yeah, that's his name. Picked him up downtown for loitering, causing a disturbance." Harris didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned to the sergeant. "Pull his file, now." The room fell into silence as the sergeant typed quickly into the system. A moment later, the screen flickered, and a file appeared. The sergeant's eyebrows shot up as he read. Harris moved behind the desk, his eyes scanning the screen. Then he straightened, his face unreadable as he turned back to Evans. "Tell me you're joking," Harris said, his voice dangerously calm. Evans frowned. "What?" Harris's voice sharpened. "Tell me you didn't just arrest a decorated Navy SEAL and throw him in a holding cell over loitering." A hush fell over the room. Even Torres looked stunned. Evans scoffed. "Come on, that's got to be a mistake. This guy?" He gestured toward Marcus. "He's just some what, Evans?" Harris cut him off. "Some homeless guy? Some nobody?" Evans hesitated, suddenly aware that something had shifted beyond his control. Harris turned back to the screen, reading aloud. "Marcus Carter, former Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy, served in multiple high-risk combat zones, 2 Silver Stars, a Bronze Star with Valor, multiple commendations, honorable discharge." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle in the room. "This man is a war hero." Evans' face paled. That can't be right." Harris ignored him and walked straight to the holding cell. He studied Marcus for a moment before speaking. "I remember hearing your name before, SEAL Team 3, right?" Marcus met his gaze. "That's right." Harris exhaled, his voice lowering. "What happened, Carter?" Marcus hesitated, but then he simply said, "Life." Harris nodded slowly, understanding more than the words conveyed. Then he turned back to Evans, his expression steely. "Get those damn forms off my desk. He's being released immediately." Evans took a step forward. "Captain, with all due respect..." "With all due respect, officer," Harris snapped. "I don't know what the hell you were thinking, but you just made this department look real bad." He gestured at Marcus. "Get him out of that cell now." Torres moved without hesitation, unlocking the door. Marcus stood slowly, rolling his shoulders. As he stepped out, Harris gave him a nod. "I'm sorry this happened, Carter." Marcus didn't respond right away. He simply looked at Evans, who was glaring at him, his face stiff with resentment. Marcus knew men like him, men who couldn't admit when they were wrong. "Thank you, Captain," Marcus finally said, turning to Harris. Harris nodded again before turning back to Evans. "My office, now." Evans clenched his jaw but followed. Torres watched them go, then turned to Marcus. For the first time, he really looked at him. Not just as another face, not as a suspect, but as a man. "You okay?" Torres asked. Marcus exhaled, adjusting his coat. "Yeah," he said simply. But in his mind, he knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Officer Daniel Torres sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen, but his mind was elsewhere. The scene at the station kept replaying in his head. Captain Harris recognizing Marcus Carter, the tension in Evans' face when the truth came out, and most of all, the quiet dignity Marcus had maintained through it all. Something about it didn't sit right with Torres. He had arrested plenty of people in his career, but Marcus wasn't like the others. The way he had carried himself, the way he had stayed calm despite Evans' hostility, it wasn't the demeanor of a man who had anything to hide. It was the demeanor of a man who had already seen worse than anything the police could throw at him. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. A few clicks, and he had Marcus Carter's file pulled up again. The commendations, the medals, the years of service, it was all there, plain as day. But what wasn't there was just as important. What had happened to Marcus Carter after his time in the Navy? Torres started digging. He checked military records, old newspaper articles, anything that could fill in the gaps. The more he read, the more his respect for Marcus grew. Then he found it. A news article from 5 years ago. Tragedy strikes war hero. Navy SEAL loses family in drunk driving incident. Torres' stomach sank as he scanned the article. Marcus Carter had been married. His wife and young daughter had been killed by a drunk driver while he was deployed overseas. The driver had been a repeat offender, but due to legal loopholes had only served minimal time. By the time Marcus had returned home, there was nothing left for him. Torres exhaled, leaning back in his chair. No wonder Marcus had ended up on the streets. The weight of that kind of loss, it could break anyone. He was still deep in thought when a shadow fell over his desk. Looking up, he saw Captain Harris standing there, arms crossed. "You're looking into Carter," Harris said, not asking, stating. Torres nodded. I needed to know more." Harris studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Good instinct. But you should know, Evans isn't letting this go." Torres frowned. "What do you mean?" Harris shook his head, looking toward his office where Evans had stormed off earlier. "He's pissed, embarrassed. And when guys like him feel that way, they don't back down. They double down." Torres clenched his jaw. "You think he's going to try something?" "I don't think," Harris said grimly. "I know." Flashback. A pivotal moment in Marcus's Navy SEAL career 5 years earlier. Marcus Carter crouched behind a crumbling wall, gripping his rifle. The village was eerily silent now, the gunfire that had erupted minutes ago, leaving only smoke and the distant echoes of chaos. His SEAL team had been ambushed, the mission shifting from a simple extraction to survival. "Bravo 1, do you copy?" His earpiece crackled. "Copy," Marcus whispered, eyes scanning the area. "3 down, 2 wounded. We're holding position." He looked to his left where his teammate Jensen was clutching his bleeding leg. Another man, Ramirez, lay still, his chest barely rising. "We're not leaving them behind," Marcus said firmly. "That's suicide, Carter," the voice on the other end warned. Marcus exhaled sharply. "Then I guess I'll see you on the other side." He adjusted his grip on his rifle and gave Jensen a nod. "Cover me." Then he moved. Back to the present, Torres sat in silence, his mind swirling. This wasn't just some random guy on the street. Marcus Carter had once been willing to lay down his life for his country, for his team. And now that same country had let him fall through the cracks. Torres clenched his fists. He had joined the force to serve and protect, but after tonight he wasn't sure he liked what he was seeing from the people wearing the same badge. He looked back at the article, then at Marcus's file. No, he wasn't going to let this slide. Evans could do whatever he wanted. But Torres was going to make sure the truth came out, one way or another. The buzz inside the police station was louder than usual. Something was happening. Something bigger than a routine arrest. Word had spread fast, and now a local journalist had caught wind of the situation. Outside, the hum of traffic was interrupted by the occasional shutter of cameras and the murmuring of a growing crowd. The incident had started as just another arrest, but now it was spiraling into something far more significant. Inside the station, Marcus Carter sat on a bench, arms crossed, watching as Captain Harris spoke with a reporter near the front desk. He couldn't hear their conversation, but he could tell from Harris's stiff posture that things were getting serious. Officer Daniel Torres, standing a few feet away, had a phone in his hand scrolling through social media. What he saw made his stomach tighten. The video had gone viral. Someone had recorded the entire encounter. The moment Evans confronted Marcus, the way he escalated the situation, the unnecessary force used in the arrest. The caption read, "Homeless black veteran harassed and arrested without cause. This is America." Torres swallowed hard. The video had thousands of shares already, and the comment section was a war zone. Some defended the officers, claiming they were just doing their jobs. Others were furious, calling out injustice, questioning how a decorated war hero could be treated this way. And then there were the ones demanding action. Torres glanced toward Evans, who was standing at his desk, jaw clenched, his eyes darting toward the phone screens around him as officers whispered amongst themselves. He looked like a man trapped in his own arrogance, suddenly realizing the walls were closing in. Marcus, however, remained calm, as if he had already expected this. Then he stood. The room quieted slightly as he walked toward Evans. Not aggressively, not confrontationally, just deliberately. Evans noticed him, his shoulders squaring. "You got something to say?" he snapped, his voice laced with irritation. Marcus studied him for a moment. Then in a steady voice he said, "Why do you hate me so much?" The question caught Evans off guard. His face twitched like he hadn't expected Marcus to be so direct. "I don't hate you," he scoffed. "Don't flatter yourself." Marcus tilted his head. "Then what is it? What about me makes you so sure I'm the problem?" Evans looked around, suddenly aware of the eyes on him. "This isn't about you," he said defensively. "It's about keeping the streets safe." Marcus let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Safe from what exactly? From people like me?" Evans didn't answer. His fingers curled into a fist at his side. Marcus took a step closer, his voice lower now. "I served my country. I fought for people like you. And yet you look at me like I'm nothing, like I don't belong." He exhaled, shaking his head. "You don't even see me, do you?" Evans's face tightened, but for the first time there was something else there, a flicker of doubt. Before he could respond, the station doors swung open. A group of people entered. Veterans, men and women of all ages, wearing jackets with patches, hats that read US Navy, Army, Marines. They walked with quiet strength, their eyes scanning the room until they landed on Marcus. And then one of them, a man in his 60s with a Marine Corps emblem on his jacket, spoke. "We're here for him." The station fell into silence. Captain Harris stepped forward, nodding at the man. "And you are?" "Sergeant Major Paul Whitaker," the man replied. "Retired. I served with men like Carter, men who gave everything only to be left behind when they came home. That stops today." More murmurs rippled through the station. Evans shifted uncomfortably. Marcus looked at the veterans, his chest tightening. He had spent so long feeling invisible, and now, for the first time in years, he wasn't alone. Outside, the news had spread. The protesters were growing. The media was asking questions, and Marcus Carter wasn't just another nameless face anymore. He was a symbol of a truth that could no longer be ignored. The protest outside the police station had grown significantly by the hour. What started as a handful of people murmuring in concern had transformed into a full-blown demonstration. Signs were raised high with messages like "Justice for Marcus Carter" and "Support our veterans," while voices chanted in unison, demanding accountability. The media had arrived in full force, cameras rolling, reporters speaking urgently into microphones. Inside, the tension was just as thick. Officers who had initially ignored the situation now shifted uncomfortably under the weight of the public scrutiny. The station's front desk phone rang non-stop. Calls from concerned citizens, veteran organizations, and most notably, city officials who had been dragged into the controversy. Evans sat stiffly at his desk, eyes locked on his computer screen. but everyone could see the tension in his posture. He had expected to get away with this like so many times before. But this time, he had underestimated the power of visibility. Marcus Carter had become a national story. In one of the conference rooms, Captain Harris was on the phone with the mayor's office, his voice low but firm. "Yes, sir. I understand the severity of the situation. No, sir, I was not aware until I saw the file myself. Yes, understood." He exhaled and hung up. Torres, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped inside. "That didn't sound good." Harris rubbed his forehead. "The mayor wants this handled, fast. He doesn't want bad press over a wrongful arrest, especially with an election coming up." Torres nodded, glancing toward the holding area where Marcus still sat, speaking quietly with Sergeant Major Whitaker and the other veterans. "So what happens now?" Harris leaned back in his chair. "Evans is in trouble, big trouble. The department's already reviewing his history, and let's just say, this isn't his first complaint." Torres folded his arms. "I figured as much." Harris glanced at him. "And you? You ready to testify if it comes to that?" Torres hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Yeah. Marcus didn't do anything wrong. And Evans, he crossed the line." Harris studied him, then gave a nod of approval. "Good, because the internal affairs team is already involved." Torres exhaled slowly. This was bigger than he had anticipated. Outside the station, the crowd outside continued to swell. Local activists had joined in, along with more veterans who had heard about Marcus's situation through social media. Then, another figure arrived, someone who immediately drew attention: the city's mayor. Cameras flashed as he stepped out of his black sedan, flanked by his aides. The crowd turned toward him, their chants shifting into demands for answers. "Mayor Connolly, do you support the wrongful arrest of a veteran?" one reporter shouted. "How will the city respond to these allegations?" another pressed. The mayor raised a hand, signaling for calm. "I understand everyone's concerns," he said, his voice smooth and diplomatic. "I assure you we are taking this matter seriously. I have already spoken with the police department, and a full investigation is underway. I promise you justice will be served." The crowd wasn't satisfied with vague promises, but the mayor's presence signaled just how far this issue had reached. Inside the station, Captain Harris received a call. He answered, listening for a moment before nodding. Then he turned to Torres. "The mayor's demanding a meeting. Evans is being called in." Torres let out a slow breath. "Looks like this is it." Harris nodded grimly. "Yeah, and it's not looking good for Evans." Meanwhile, Marcus, still seated in the holding area, could hear the muffled voices of the crowd outside. He didn't need to see them to know what was happening. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't just surviving, he was being seen. The conference room inside the police station was tense. The blinds were shut, muffling the sound of the protest outside, but the weight of the situation was impossible to ignore. At the long table sat Captain Harris, Officer Daniel Torres, the department's internal affairs investigator, and across from them, Officer Richard Evans. Evans sat rigidly, arms crossed, his expression a mask of indifference, but Torres could see the tension in his clenched jaw, the flicker of unease behind his eyes. He wasn't as unaffected as he wanted to appear. At the head of the table, the internal affairs investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Lisa Grant, set down a file and folded her hands. "Officer Evans, I assume you know why you're here." Evans scoffed. "Because some homeless guy decided to play the victim?" Torres felt his stomach tighten. Even now, Evans refused to take responsibility. Grant's expression didn't change. "Because you made an unjustified arrest. Because you escalated a situation that did not warrant police intervention. And because this department has received multiple complaints regarding your behavior in similar incidents." Evans sat up straighter. "Complaints? From who?" Harris spoke up now, his voice firm. "From civilians, from other officers, and now from the mayor's office." He leaned forward. "You embarrass this department, Evans, and you put us in a national spotlight for the worst possible reason." Evans looked between them, his confidence starting to crack. "So what? You're throwing me under the bus to save face?" Grant didn't flinch. "We're holding you accountable for your actions." Torres cleared his throat and spoke for the first time. "I was there, Evans. You didn't just arrest Marcus Carter. You targeted him. You wanted to make a point, and now it's coming back to you." Evans glared at Torres, his eyes filled with resentment. "You think you're better than me, Torres?" Torres met his gaze without flinching. "No, but I know I'm better than that." The silence in the room was thick. Grant exhaled, flipping open the file. Officer Evans, after reviewing the evidence, including video footage, witness statements, and your prior record, the department has decided on disciplinary action. Evans' fists tightened. What kind of action? Harris didn't blink. You're being terminated from the force, effective immediately. Evans froze, his face paled, his breath catching. You're kidding. No, Grant said. And given the complaints against you, you may be facing additional legal consequences. You should prepare for that. Evans shot up from his chair. This is bullshit. He turned to Harris. You're letting them ruin my career over this? Over him? Harris didn't flinch. You ruined your own career, Evans. Marcus Carter isn't the reason you're sitting here. You are. Evans looked like he wanted to say more, but the weight of the decision had already crashed down on him. He clenched his jaw, his face twisted with anger and disbelief. Finally, with nothing left to fight, he stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The tension in the room eased slightly, but no one looked relieved. Harris rubbed his temples. Well, that's done. Torres nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. This wasn't just about Evans, it was about the system that had allowed him to get away with this behavior for so long. And it was about Marcus Carter, who had suffered because of it. Harris stood. Go let Carter know he's free to go. Torres nodded and left the room, heading toward the holding area. Marcus Carter's release. Marcus was still sitting on the bench when Torres approached. He looked up, his expression unreadable. You're free to go, Torres said. Marcus studied him for a moment, then stood. Evans? Fired, Torres said simply. Probably facing charges too. Marcus nodded as if he had expected this outcome all along. Good. Torres hesitated, then spoke. Listen, Carter, he exhaled. I should have done more back there. I knew Evans was in the wrong, but I didn't push back hard enough. That's on me. Marcus tilted his head slightly. But you did push back, and that's what matters. Torres looked at him, unsure how to respond. Marcus extended a hand. Torres hesitated only a second before shaking it. Marcus gave him a firm nod. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the front entrance. Torres followed, watching as Marcus stepped outside, where a wall of people stood waiting. The moment Marcus emerged, the crowd erupted into applause. Veterans stepped forward, greeting him with salutes, handshakes, and quiet words of respect. Journalists surged forward, but the veterans shielded Marcus from the chaos. Torres remained in the doorway, watching. For the first time since meeting Marcus Carter, he saw something different in the man's posture. Not just resilience, but hope. The crowd outside the police station had begun to disperse, but the impact of the night's events remained. Marcus Carter stood at the steps, surrounded by a small group of veterans who had come to support him. Their handshakes were firm, their nods full of understanding. They had all walked different roads, but they knew what it felt like to serve and then be forgotten. One man stepped forward, Sergeant Major Paul Whitaker. You're not alone, Marcus, he said. You never were, and you never have to be again. Marcus met his gaze. It had been years since he'd felt any real sense of belonging. The world had moved on without him, but now, standing here with these men and women beside him, something shifted. From the edge of the crowd, Daniel Torres approached. He hesitated, then extended a card. There's a veteran support organization downtown. They help guys like you get back on their feet. Housing, job placement, whatever you need. Marcus took the card, turning it over in his fingers. Why are you doing this? Torres sighed. Because I should have done more back there, because this isn't how it's supposed to be. And maybe, he shrugged, maybe it's time to start doing things right. Marcus studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. Appreciate it. Torres stepped back, watching as Marcus looked out over the city. The same city that had ignored him for years. But now things were different. One of the veterans clapped a hand on Marcus's shoulder. Come on, brother, let's get you somewhere warm. For the first time in a long time, Marcus didn't resist the help. He let them lead him away from the station, away from the concrete sidewalks that had become his home. He didn't know what came next, but for the first time in years he was willing to find out. Weeks later, a video surfaced on social media, one that captured Marcus Carter standing before a group of young officers at the academy. He wasn't dressed in worn-out clothes anymore. He looked strong, rebuilt. His voice was steady as he spoke. I've been judged for how I look, for where I've been, but none of that changes who I am. Dignity isn't something you earn, it's something you already have. and it's something no one has the right to take away from you. Torres watched the video from his desk at the precinct. He exhaled, a small, thoughtful smile crossing his lips. Marcus Carter's story wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. The evening air was crisp, the city bathed in the golden glow of streetlights. Marcus Carter walked with a newfound sense of direction. He wasn't the same man who had been sitting on that cold sidewalk weeks ago. He had started to rebuild, taking slow but steady steps toward a future he had once thought was beyond reach. But some things, some people, didn't let go so easily. "Hey, Carter!" The voice was sharp, familiar. Marcus turned to see Richard Evans standing near a dimly lit alley. He was out of uniform now, his badge and gun stripped away. The man who had once walked the streets with unchecked authority now looked restless, lost. Marcus stopped but didn't step closer. Evans let out a bitter laugh. "So what now? You get to walk around like some hero while I lose everything?" Marcus studied him. The rage in Evans' voice wasn't just about the job. It was about control. Control that had slipped through his fingers the moment he had been held accountable for his actions. "You lost your job because of your own choices," Marcus said calmly. "Not because of me." Evans' face twisted. "You think you're better than me just because you were in the military?" Marcus shook his head. "No, but I know I was taught to respect people, to see them for who they are, not who I assume they are." Evans scoffed, his fingers curling into fists. "You think all this changes anything? The world's still gonna look at you the same way it did before. You'll always be—" "Careful," Marcus interrupted, his tone even but firm. Evans stopped short, nostrils flaring. He had come here to provoke a reaction, to reclaim some sense of dominance. But Marcus wasn't giving it to him. A few people on the sidewalk had stopped to watch. The tension in the air was palpable. Evans took a step forward. "I should have handled things differently," he muttered, voice low. "You got lucky." Marcus exhaled slowly. Luck had nothing to do with it. The truth did. Evans' jaw clenched. His body language screamed frustration, but there was something else beneath it. Doubt. A young woman standing nearby raised her phone, recording. Evans noticed, his gaze flicking toward the camera. He was trapped. No badge to shield him now, no authority to justify his words. Marcus took a step closer, not in aggression but in something more powerful. Control. "You've got two choices, Evans," Marcus said quietly. "You can keep blaming me for your mistakes, or you can figure out who you are without that uniform." For a long moment, Evans just stood there. The weight of the moment hung between them. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, his shoulders hunched, his presence diminished. Marcus let out a slow breath. The confrontation was over. And he had won. Not by fighting, but by refusing to engage in the battle Evans wanted. The bystanders murmured as they lowered their phones, realizing they had just witnessed something far more significant than a physical altercation. Marcus Carter had chosen dignity over conflict, and in doing so he had truly reclaimed his power. The video of Marcus Carter's final encounter with Richard Evans spread quickly. People expected a fight, but instead they saw something more powerful, a man refusing to be provoked, standing his ground with dignity. The footage sparked conversations nationwide. Some praised Marcus for his restraint, while others condemned Evans, calling him a symbol of unchecked authority. The department issued a statement distancing themselves from Evans, and legal action loomed over him. His downfall was complete. But for Marcus, this moment wasn't about revenge. It was about change. Days later, at a veteran support event, Marcus stood before a packed audience, including Officer Torres, Captain Harris, and other community leaders. His voice was steady as he addressed them. "People assume they know your story just by looking at you. They don't. Dignity isn't something you earn, it's something no one can take from you." His words resonated. Torres, sitting in the crowd, felt their weight. He had seen firsthand how easy it was to overlook people like Marcus, but not anymore. As Marcus stepped off the stage, several veterans approached him, not just to thank him, but to offer him something he hadn't had in years, a place to belong. The impact didn't stop there. The footage of Marcus's arrest and speech became part of police training programs, forcing officers to confront their biases. It was a shift, not a revolution overnight, but a step forward. Later that evening, Marcus walked past a man sitting on the same sidewalk where he had once been. Their eyes met, and Marcus recognized the same struggle in them. Instead of walking by, Marcus reached into his pocket, pulled out a veteran resource card, and handed it over. "You're not invisible," he said, and for the first time in years he knew he wasn't either. The city moved forward as it always did, but for Marcus Carter everything had changed. He no longer drifted through the streets unseen. He had a place to stay, a new support system, and most importantly, a renewed sense of purpose. At a community event weeks later, Marcus stood beside Sergeant Major Whitaker and Officer Daniel Torres, speaking with young recruits about honor, responsibility, and the reality of life after service. His voice carried weight, not just because of his past, but because of what he had overcome. Meanwhile, Richard Evans had faded into obscurity. Without his badge, his power disappeared. The last anyone heard, he had left the city trying to outrun the shadow of his actions. As for Torres, he continued to push for change within the police force. He had learned firsthand that being a good officer wasn't about enforcing control, it was about protecting dignity. On a quiet evening, Marcus found himself walking past the very spot where everything had begun. The cold pavement, the flickering streetlights, the city's indifferent hum, it was all the same. But he was not. A young officer, barely out of the academy, recognized him. "Mr. Carter." Marcus turned, raising an eyebrow. The officer hesitated, then extended a hand. "I just wanted to say, your story changed the way I see things, thank you." Marcus shook his hand, offering a small, knowing nod. As he walked away, he reflected on everything. He had been judged, he had been discarded, but in the end he had risen, because the truth was undeniable. We never truly know someone's story until we take the time to listen.